Eternal God, in the reading of the Scripture, may your word be heard. In the meditations of our hearts, may your word be known. And in the faithfulness of our lives, may your word be shown. Amen. What are some fun rituals that we have in our lives? I remember my grandmother saying to Larissa when she was very young, I think we were crossing a covered bridge. So what do you say about a covered bridge? Anybody know? You make a wish. You blow your horn. What my grandmother says, hold your breath. And raise your feet up off the floor until the very end. You know, I was tempted to really slow down, going across the bridge. There's some of these fun traditions, and if you're a follower of sports, the various players have these marvelous, especially baseball. A ritual is a sequence of events in which they go through. They touch this, and it's the same thing. They have to go through the same thing. Am I within screen all right? Okay? Okay. Get my best side. No. So these rituals that connect us with things, and I was taken with the article that appeared in the Herald. It was Monday or Tuesday, and it was around changing the culture within Cape Breton in terms of changing the heavy drinking culture in Cape Breton. And it took me back to 30 years ago when I started my ministry there, when the Archdeacon, it started with Archdeacon Brenda Drake talking about sort of the send-offs in Cape Breton, funerals, memorial services. And she talked about, she just sort of mused, because she would see it all the time, how many bottles of liquor would be buried in the caskets. How many are buried across Cape Breton? Sort of that culture of drinking. And what do you do, with that? How do you change that? And there's certainly going to be a fair amount of conversation and discussion around that. But I think that we also need to be able to take a look at ourselves and to have some fun with some of our traditions. I mean, as our colleagues in Cape Breton, especially the Cape Breton radio station that launched the Donald Trump promotion to moving to Cape Breton, it's been interesting just to watch the response that folks are getting for that, tongue-in-cheek. But rituals are, by definition, are religious or solemn ceremonies that are conducted or done to remind us of something, often on an unconscious level, to remind us of who we are, who we're connected with. And in the particular case of the religious thing, to connect us with those pieces of the divine. Now, if I were to do this, what am I doing? I'm breaking bread. Okay? And that ritual is meant, when we raise up the bread and give thanks and break it, it's meant to connect us with all those who have broken bread before. Not just Jesus and the disciples, which in the Christian context is the main piece, but also the Last Supper, of the breaking of the bread, of participating in those particular events that save. And so the breaking of the bread or pouring of water, these rituals or symbols that make a connection for us. Now, I was looking at the Scout method, so I was going back to Lord and Lady Baden-Powell and some of the things that they wrote around how you find a way, a safe place, to create citizens who are independent, who have ambition, who provide leadership. And he talks about the Scout way as being that way of training for independence and for leadership and ambition, and training for a moral code and positive goals. According to Baden-Powell, the Scout method works naturally and unconsciously. Naturally in a way that it follows the natural impulses of the Scout, and unconsciously that the Scout is not aware of the education. So one of the rituals that we did here, saying the law, saying the promises, those things that go through each thing. And what do Cubs, what's their chant? What's the Cub chant? We dub, 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 dub?
We dib, dib, dib.
We dib, dib, dub, dub. What does that mean?
Do our best, do our best, do, something best.
Your, maybe?
How about your? Does that work?
Yep.
We dub, 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 dub. We do our best, do our best, do our best. We dib, 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 dib. Okay, we do your best, do your best, do your best. I mean, that sense of building within that connection, okay, that connection. And so there's a number of rituals. One of the things that I was interested, I picked up a piece from Baden-Powell. Baden-Powell wrote about the Scout method and talking about why it's important and how he sees it. He says, the Scout should paddle his own canoe, metaphorically speaking. He should not travel by a rowing boat with his back to where he's going or she is going, rowed by others and someone else at the rudder, but alone in the canoe, facing the future, paddling and steering by himself or herself. This ancient story that we have from Genesis is a very, very old layer of tradition. Some will dispute that because some will say that it's also, it's built in within sort of the sacrificial system of the temple, and it supports that. So some may say that the priest brought that particular piece into Genesis. But I don't think it is. I think it's a very old tradition. And it's a very strange story. What did you hear in the story? This is where you earn your cake. What did you hear in the story? What did God say to Abram first? Go back to the thing and give them a little help. If I wasn't in the way, you might be able to see it. He told them to be very, very afraid, because if they weren't good, they were going to...
He said, "Do not be afraid, I am your shield."
Do not be afraid, I am your shield. So whatever is happening, I will be there to help you and protect you. Do not be afraid. Okay? And so Abraham, through his life, when he leaves the country of Ur, his homeland, and sets out because God told him to, there's this wonderful story of Abraham and Sarah. And in this particular case, he says, do not be afraid. But what does believing mean in this case? Does it mean that he just has to follow blindly? Because what does Abraham do? He asks the question. He says, yeah, I know and I'm trusting you, but I still don't have an heir. You know, you can give me all the riches in the world, you can give me all the land in the world and all the blessing in the world, but unless I have an heir, unless I have children, they really mean nothing. So what he does in this is he says, well, And it really sets it up. I like it because what it means is that it says that believing doesn't mean that you can't question, that you can't wonder when things aren't going so well. When we get the news from the doctor, or there's a really tough situation, or work isn't going so well. It's okay to say, well, God, you said that you'd walk with me, and we say every week, we're not alone, we live in God's world. Well, I'm not feeling it a lot right now, God. What can we do? It's okay to say, well, I don't look around, I don't see any kids. How are you going to fulfill this promise? And so they go on, and he says, why don't you go out and have a look at the stars at night, and you can count them, and your children are going to be like that, but that's off in the future. But Abram and Sarah, they believe. They move forward. And then there is this very strange piece. Let's go back to the bottom when they talk about the sacrifice. Okay, so what are they sacrificing? Can you help me with that?
They're sacrificing the animals?
Yeah, the animals. What exactly, though? Okay. What's a heifer? A cow. Okay. Abram had some work to do cutting that in half. He literally cuts it in half. Okay? He cuts it right in half. Okay? And he cuts the female goat and the ram and the turtle dove. No, not the turtle dove and the pigeon. He doesn't. Okay? Cuts them out, sets them up on an altar, which was the ground at the time. Okay? Divides them. Okay? And he's even so concerned, handshake would have been so much easier. Okay? But that's not what's happening. We have this particular story, and it must have been really, really important to Abraham and to the tradition of that time to do this sacrifice this way. We've lost the meaning of it. We've lost it to history. However, there is something going on because he wouldn't have stayed awake to chase away the birds of prey and the vultures and those who came down. He protected this sacrifice. And then there's this sense that he has this dream that there's fire going down in between them. The sealing of a covenant, the purifying of a covenant. Some scholars might say that it's also a warning. That unless you live up to the covenant, that's, the fire will come. I don't think that's really the case. It's just an important marking of a relationship. And an important piece that they continue to do throughout their history, whether it is in the breaking of the matzah, okay, the sharing of the unleavened bread. Do this in remembrance of me. It's such an important ritual to our identity, to who we are. I want to leave you with just two stories because we're getting close to cake time. One comes out of the American Southwest. The Hopi nation has a ritual that is known as a children's fire. Kind of strange name. But a children's fire, what they would do in terms of if they were making big decisions for the tribe, is that they would gather in a medicine circle, okay, and in the center would be a fire. And that's what they called the children's fire. But they always considered everything in the medicine circle. The fire represented the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren for 7 generations. And what you did is that when you were making any decision, you had to consider how it would affect the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, and so on for 7 generations. When we think about the things that we're doing in terms of our environmental policy, in terms of other things in our world, this could be a fairly good practice. To think about it for 7 generations. How will it affect them? And the other story comes out of World War II. A bit of a sad story, but it's a story in which a young girl is separated from her family and ends up in a refugee camp during the Second World War in Germany. And conditions were not very good. And the children, especially, that were refugees and separated from their families, would often go to sleep at night and not really understand or know where their next meal was coming from. Well, a tradition that grew up out of that was baking of bread and having bread, sort of that symbol of bread being broken open, but that bread of nourishing us and keeping us alive. And in this particular story is that one person that they realized, even with the rations of bread that they had, is that in order to make it more helpful for these little girls, for these children, was they said, keep a little bit of the bread. Okay, keep it close to your heart during the night. So you'd know you had bread, that you had something to eat. And so a spiritual practice perhaps for us during Lent is to make our heart bread. What are those things that we need that will keep close to our heart? Well, how can we build, how do we bake that particular bread? How do we build it? Like we built the pyramid of 113 cans of peanut butter for the food bank. Perhaps it's giving food, a can or so each Sunday to the food bank. There's a variety of ways. Perhaps it's volunteering during the week. Perhaps it's simply doing a good turn to bring in the scout and guiding theme. And I know that your smiles and your grace and your love and your care are very important to making that heart bread for our world. That might be a practice that we can think about when we think of those rituals that connect us as we look at this strange and wonderful story that's part of our story and find ways to retell it, find ways to love and to care for one another. Amen.